The evening was alive with the hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses. The restaurant had been specially prepared for a high-profile dinner, one that promised luxury, elegance, and the kind of opulence that few could imagine. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over every polished surface. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes and the subtle aroma of fine cuisine. Waiters moved gracefully between the tables, carrying plates with the skill and precision of performers in a silent ballet. Among the guests was a young heiress, well known in social circles for her beauty, her fashion, and her sometimes reckless confidence. She had arrived in a sleek, black car, stepping out in a gown that shimmered under the lights. Her presence drew immediate attention. People glanced at her as she entered, some with admiration, others with the polite distance that comes from meeting someone who radiates both wealth and authority. She was not here quietly. She was loud, expressive, and unmistakably aware of the power her status gave her. The restaurant staff had been briefed in advance about her arrival, and while some felt a little nervous, they maintained a professional composure. Among them was a young waitress who had been working at the restaurant for several months. She was quiet, attentive, and always careful to treat every guest with respect. She had learned early on that patience and politeness were as important as skill when serving those who could be demanding. Tonight, she wore a neatly pressed uniform, her hair tied back, and a gentle, approachable smile on her face. The heiress had arrived with a small group, all laughing and speaking in tones that suggested familiarity with extravagance. She waved at the staff without a word, moving confidently toward her table, already inspecting the arrangement of plates, glasses, and cutlery as if it belonged to her. The young waitress approached, carrying a tray with water and wine glasses. "Good evening, welcome. Can I offer you some drinks while you look at the menu?" she asked politely, keeping her tone warm despite the slight tension that always accompanied serving someone so prominent. The heiress barely looked at her. "Yes, wine. Red. And make it quick," she said, her voice sharp, her tone leaving no room for delay. She tapped her manicured fingers on the table impatiently. The waitress nodded politely and moved to fulfill the request, careful not to spill a drop. She had learned early in her career that careful attention could prevent accidents, but also that the unpredictability of wealthy guests sometimes made even the most careful efforts seem trivial. As she placed the glasses on the table, the heiress continued to glance around, her eyes resting briefly on other tables as though she were judging the patrons, the service, and the environment all at once. The other guests, a mix of socialites and business figures, chatted and laughed, but there was an unspoken awareness in the room that something unusual was about to happen. The young waitress felt the tension as she moved from table to table, ensuring every detail was perfect. It was then that the heiress, in a sudden display of carelessness, or perhaps intentional cruelty, knocked her wine glass toward the young waitress. The red liquid spilled across her crisp uniform, soaking her sleeves and leaving a dark, wet stain that spread quickly. The waitress froze, caught between shock and the instinct to remain composed. Gasps filled the air around them. Some guests whispered to one another, unsure whether to intervene. Others looked down at their plates, pretending not to see. The heiress laughed lightly, almost theatrically, as if enjoying the scene she had created. "Oh, watch your step," she said, her tone mocking, as if the spill were a playful game rather than a deliberate humiliation. The young waitress's hands shook slightly as she held her tray, the wine dripping slowly onto the floor. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but the weight of the room's attention kept her silent. Every eye seemed to be on her, and yet no one moved. She felt small, despite her years of experience handling difficult customers. The restaurant manager quickly stepped forward, offering towels and apologies, but the heiress waved him off. "It's fine," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Accidents happen, don't they?" Her laughter rang louder this time, and some of the other guests, caught between amusement and discomfort, tried to hide their reactions. The young waitress, meanwhile, tried to steady herself. She cleaned the spill carefully, her movements precise, while keeping her head up and her expression neutral. She knew that losing composure in front of someone like the heiress could make the situation worse. Despite her embarrassment, she continued to work, refilling glasses and attending to other guests as though nothing had happened. Every now and then, she would glance at the heiress, who seemed to revel in the attention she had caused. The heiress's friends whispered to one another, laughing softly, further isolating the young waitress in a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. She kept her voice polite, her tone calm, and her posture professional. Deep down, she wanted to run, to escape the humiliation, but she also knew that standing firm with dignity could make a bigger statement than any argument. As the evening continued, the heiress ordered dish after dish, her behavior alternating between dismissive and demanding. She criticized the timing of the food, the temperature of the drinks, and even the placement of utensils. Each time, the young waitress moved efficiently, serving with precision and grace, even as she felt the sting of unfair treatment. Some guests began to admire her composure, though no one said a word. Her quiet determination in the face of such rudeness slowly became the center of the room's attention, though the heiress was too focused on herself to notice. There was a strange rhythm to the evening, a push and pull between arrogance and professionalism. The young waitress had learned that serving in high-stakes environments required more than skill. It required resilience. She took deep breaths and reminded herself that her self-worth was not defined by someone else's cruelty. The heiress, on the other hand, seemed unaware of the effect she was having on those around her. Her laughter and teasing were loud, but there was a faint hint of insecurity beneath her confident exterior, a sign that perhaps she was not accustomed to anyone standing their ground calmly in front of her. In one moment, as the heiress raised her glass for a toast, the young waitress noticed the fleeting expression of frustration cross her face. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She realized that beneath the wealth, the fashion, and the confidence, the heiress was human too, vulnerable, easily surprised, and not always in control. This observation gave the young waitress a quiet sense of strength. She continued her work, her movements steady, her smile genuine, and her attention unwavering. The rest of the guests began to settle into their meals, some stealing glances at the dramatic scene unfolding. There was an unspoken curiosity about what would happen next, but the young waitress refused to let the tension overwhelm her. She moved with grace, anticipating the needs of everyone at the table, her professionalism a quiet defiance against the heiress's cruelty. The contrast between the two women, one flaunting wealth and power, the other showing patience and dignity, was striking. And then, just as the room seemed to reach a tense equilibrium, a subtle shift occurred. The young waitress sensed it first, the quiet stir of anticipation, the sense that something unexpected was about to happen. The heiress laughed again, but this time, there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. The young waitress didn't know it yet, but the evening was about to take a turn that would change everything. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow of chandeliers would soon be replaced by a moment that would leave everyone in the room stunned. As she continued her duties, the young waitress felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. Relief that she had maintained her composure so far, and nervousness for what might come next. She cleaned another table, refilled another glass, and reminded herself to stay calm. She had faced difficult guests before, but something about this heiress felt different. There was a sense of unpredictability, of power laced with insecurity, that made every interaction charged with tension. By the end of the first hour, the scene was set for an encounter that would leave an impression on everyone present. The young waitress, soaked in wine yet standing tall, had already earned a silent respect from some of the other guests. They watched in quiet admiration as she handled what could have been a humiliating moment with grace, professionalism, and courage. The heiress, unaware of the admiration forming around her, continued to bask in her sense of superiority, oblivious to the fact that the evening's story was just beginning. The young waitress continued moving through the tables, her movements precise and measured, despite the lingering dampness of wine on her uniform. Each step, each motion was an exercise in quiet determination. She knew the heiress's behavior was far from ordinary, but she refused to let it shake her professionalism. She reminded herself that she had faced difficult situations before, yet this one felt heavier somehow. There was an audacity in the heiress's actions that made the air tense, as if every guest had been placed in a silent trial, observing what would happen next. The heiress, meanwhile, had grown more animated. She laughed and joked loudly with her friends, leaning back in her chair and sipping her wine with an air of untouchable privilege. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the stem of her glass, a subtle display of impatience that hinted at her restless energy. She seemed to delight in the disruption she had caused earlier, as though her power could be measured by the discomfort of others. But beneath the confidence, there was a small flicker of curiosity in her eyes, one that she was too proud to acknowledge. The other guests shifted in their seats, glancing discreetly at the scene between the heiress and the young waitress. Some exchanged whispers, wondering if anyone would finally confront the heiress, or if she would continue her theatrics unchecked. A few of the restaurant staff lingered nearby, hesitant to intervene, knowing the delicate balance between professionalism and authority. The tension was palpable, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap at any moment. Despite the stares and whispered remarks, the young waitress carried on with her duties. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and offered gentle smiles, maintaining an air of calm composure. She understood that her reaction, or lack of it, spoke louder than any words she could say. In her silence, there was strength, a quiet statement that cruelty could not easily shake her. Every careful movement was a small victory, a way to reclaim control in a situation where the odds seemed stacked against her. The heiress suddenly leaned across the table, pointing at a dish and speaking in a tone that was both demanding and sharp. "Is this how you serve guests in this city? It's cold, completely cold," she exclaimed, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Her friends laughed softly, not out of humor, but as if to affirm her dominance over the room. The young waitress swallowed her instinctive frustration and replied politely, "I apologize, madam. I will have it heated immediately." Her voice was calm, measured, and devoid of any trace of anger. As she hurried to the kitchen, she could feel eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and quiet sympathy. The kitchen staff nodded slightly as she passed, aware of the challenge she faced. She placed the dish in a warming oven, adjusted a few other plates, and returned to the heiress's table with care. Each step was a reminder of her resolve to handle the evening with dignity. Even though her uniform still bore the remnants of the earlier wine spill, she stood tall, refusing to let the stain define her. When she returned with the reheated dish, the heiress made a dismissive sound, her expression still cocky, still confident. "Well, finally," she said, barely looking at the waitress. She picked up her fork and took a small bite, still glancing around the room as if expecting someone else to fail her next. The young waitress stayed nearby, ready to respond to any additional requests, her posture professional, her attention unwavering. For a few minutes, the room settled into a tense rhythm. The heiress continued her chatter, her laughter sharp and deliberate. The young waitress moved from table to table, attending to other guests with care, her actions fluid and precise. Some guests began to notice her patience, the way she handled a difficult situation without complaint or visible irritation. There was a quiet admiration forming, though no one spoke aloud. In contrast, the heiress seemed unaware that the attention she craved from others was shifting away from her. Then came another moment that tested the young waitress's patience. The heiress, noticing a small smudge on the edge of her plate, waved her hand dramatically and called the waitress over again. "Do you see this? How can you let this happen?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. The young waitress approached calmly, nodding politely. "I apologize, madam. I will take care of it immediately." She replaced the plate with a fresh one, steady hands and calm expression masking the irritation she felt. She had learned early that reacting emotionally would only fuel the heiress's sense of power. As the heiress took a bite from the new plate, her friends continued their quiet commentary, still laughing, still reinforcing her authority. The young waitress returned to her duties, mindful of the subtle ways she could regain control over the situation. Each polite smile, each careful gesture, was a reminder that she would not be intimidated. The contrast between the two women became more noticeable with each passing moment. The heiress flaunting her status and power, the waitress demonstrating patience, skill, and quiet strength. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The front door opened, and a hush fell over the room. Guests turned their heads, curiosity sparked by the arrival of someone important. The heiress instinctively straightened, her laughter ceasing as she glanced toward the entrance. The young waitress, unaware of who had arrived, continued her work, though she sensed a subtle change in the energy of the room. Something was about to happen, and everyone felt it. A man entered quietly, his presence commanding yet understated. He moved through the room with a calm confidence, eyes scanning the tables with a discerning gaze. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The heiress's friends immediately noticed him and nudged her subtly. She followed their gaze and froze, recognizing the figure immediately. Her confident demeanor wavered for the first time that evening. This was her husband, a billionaire known for his composed nature and sharp judgment. His arrival brought a weight of authority that even she could not ignore. The young waitress, now aware of the hush, looked up just in time to see the man approaching the table. She had no idea who he was, but the sudden shift in tension made her pause. Guests whispered quietly among themselves, some stealing glances at the heiress, who now seemed suddenly uncertain. Her laughter, once bold and loud, had vanished. The confidence she had wielded so freely was now replaced by a subtle tremor of anxiety. Her husband stopped at the table, his eyes briefly scanning the scene. The wine-stained uniform, the careful posture, the calm composure of the young waitress, all of it registered in a silent moment of understanding. He turned his gaze to the heiress, who met his eyes with a mixture of pride, defiance, and now, unmistakable apprehension. The contrast between her arrogance and his composed authority was striking. The room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of conversation fading as everyone sensed the tension building. The heiress attempted to speak, to explain herself, but her voice caught. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to justify her behavior. The young waitress, meanwhile, remained calm, quietly awaiting any instruction. Her dignity in the face of humiliation had not gone unnoticed. The guests, sensing the turning point, watched intently, wondering how the heiress would respond under the scrutiny of someone whose judgment truly mattered. The billionaire husband's presence was quiet but commanding. He did not raise his voice, did not scold, but the weight of his attention was enough to make the heiress shrink in place. Her previous bravado had no power here. He asked her calmly, almost gently, "What happened here?" His question was simple, but it carried authority and expectation. Every eye in the restaurant focused on her, and for the first time that evening, she felt the full weight of accountability. The heiress's friends exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen her act with arrogance countless times, but now, faced with her husband's presence, even they seemed unsure how to respond. The young waitress continued to stand quietly, her hands folded in front of her, her expression neutral. She was no longer the target of ridicule. She was now an observer of a larger moment, one that had the potential to change the course of the evening entirely. As the heiress stammered, attempting to justify her actions, her husband remained composed. His calm demeanor amplified the heiress's discomfort. She realized, in that moment, that wealth and status could not shield her from scrutiny, not when someone she respected or feared was present. The room was silent, every guest caught between anticipation and disbelief. The young waitress, despite the lingering embarrassment from the earlier incident, felt a quiet sense of vindication. She had faced cruelty with composure, and now the tide of attention was shifting. Her husband's gaze returned to the young waitress briefly, acknowledging her calm, professional presence without a word. The heiress, seeing the subtle admiration directed toward the young woman, felt a pang of jealousy and shame. She had expected power to command respect, but instead, She found herself on the defensive, exposed by her own behavior. The contrast between her arrogance and the waitress's dignity was clear to everyone in the room. And so, the scene stood frozen in a moment of tension. The heiress, once so confident, now struggled to find her footing. The young waitress remained poised, her quiet strength a testament to patience and professionalism. The billionaire husband's calm authority filled the room, shifting the dynamics in ways that would soon have consequences. The evening, which had begun with laughter and cruelty, had transformed into a moment of reckoning, one that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The room was quiet now, filled with a tension that seemed almost tangible. The laughter and chatter that had accompanied the heiress's entrance had disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing discreetly at the young waitress, whose calm composure had begun to draw subtle admiration. The heiress, who had spent the evening wielding her wealth and status like a shield, suddenly felt exposed. Her usual confidence had faltered, replaced by a creeping unease she had not expected to feel in public. Her husband stood nearby, his presence commanding yet quiet. He was a man who rarely raised his voice, but everyone could feel the weight of his attention. The heiress tried to regain her composure, straightening her posture and smoothing her gown, but the nervous energy in her movements betrayed her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that this was no ordinary situation. She had acted cruelly, and now the consequences were staring her directly in the eyes. The young waitress continued her duties as if nothing had changed, though her mind was alert. She had sensed a shift when the man had arrived, the kind of subtle change that could alter the course of an entire evening. She moved carefully from table to table, ensuring that other guests were attended to, while keeping an eye on the heiress. Every polite gesture, every measured smile, reinforced the quiet dignity that had become her armor. She was no longer simply a target of the heiress's whims. She had become a symbol of patience and resilience, a stark contrast to the ostentation and arrogance surrounding her. The heiress's friends, previously quick to laugh and encourage her antics, now looked uneasy. Their eyes darted between the heiress and her husband, unsure how to intervene or support her. The power dynamics had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. The heiress, who had once dominated the room with her confidence, now felt a strange vulnerability. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but every word seemed inadequate under the scrutiny of someone whose judgment truly mattered. Her husband, however, did not rush her. He allowed her a moment to collect herself, giving her the opportunity to reflect on her behavior without immediately condemning her. His calm authority was a quiet force, one that highlighted the contrast between impulsive cruelty and measured dignity. The young waitress, observing from a respectful distance, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that justice might finally be recognized, and apprehension for the unknown reaction of the heiress's husband. The heiress finally spoke, her voice slightly shaky, betraying the anxiety she had tried to hide. I didn't mean for it to be so messy," she stammered, glancing briefly at the young waitress. There was an attempt at humor in her tone, a feeble effort to lighten the tension, but it fell flat. The guests, sensing the shift, leaned in slightly, their curiosity piqued. They could see that the heiress was struggling to maintain control, and the room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Her husband's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her, but his eyes still conveyed a sense of disappointment. "What you did was unnecessary," he said calmly. His voice was firm yet not harsh. It carried a quiet authority that demanded reflection rather than defensiveness. The heiress's shoulders tensed, and for the first time that evening, she truly understood the weight of her actions. She had assumed that her wealth and status allowed her to behave without consequence, but in this moment, she realized that true authority did not come from power alone. It came from respect, fairness, and integrity. The young waitress, meanwhile, continued to stand with poise. She had not spoken much during the exchange, yet her presence had an undeniable effect. Her calmness, her quiet strength, and her ability to handle a challenging situation with grace had not gone unnoticed. Even some of the heiress's friends began to observe her with a new kind of respect, recognizing that humility and professionalism often spoke louder than wealth and privilege. The heiress attempted to recover, her words coming faster now as she tried to justify her behavior. I was frustrated. It was a mistake, that's all. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Her attempt at explanation sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Her husband shook his head gently, not in anger, but in a way that emphasized the seriousness of the situation. Mistakes are human, yes, he said. But cruelty is a choice. You chose to humiliate someone. That is something you must take responsibility for. The heiress looked down, her fingers fidgeting nervously on the table. She felt a heat rising to her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and shame. For the first time, she understood that her actions had real consequences, not just for her, but for the people around her. The young waitress, who had been the target of the cruelty, now seemed to possess a quiet power. She had not retaliated or argued. She had simply remained composed, proving that dignity and patience could be more impactful than anger or confrontation. Guests began to murmur softly among themselves, recognizing the shift in the room's energy. The focus was no longer on the heiress's wealth or her friends' laughter, but on the young waitress's composure and the husband's quiet authority. It was a subtle but undeniable change, one that highlighted the contrast between true respect and superficial power. The heiress, who had spent years believing that wealth equated to control, was now confronted with a reality she had rarely faced. The idea that character mattered more than money. The young waitress, sensing that the situation was reaching a turning point, remained calm. She offered a polite smile and a gentle nod as the heiress's husband spoke, acknowledging his words without intruding. Her posture was relaxed yet attentive, a reflection of her inner strength. She had handled countless difficult guests before, but this evening had tested her in ways she had never anticipated. Yet, she had emerged with her dignity intact, and that quiet triumph did not go unnoticed. The heiress finally managed to meet her husband's eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and defiance in her gaze. I didn't mean to hurt her, she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the hushed whispers of the other guests. There was a pause, a moment where the room seemed to hold its breath. Her husband's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained serious. Intentions matter, but actions matter more, he said. You cannot let frustration justify hurting someone else. The heiress nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. She felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief that her husband was not angry in the way she had feared, and embarrassment that her behavior had been so clearly observed and judged. She glanced at the young waitress, who continued to maintain her composure with grace. In that moment, the heiress realized that the young woman's quiet strength had taught her a lesson she could not have learned through wealth or status alone. The young waitress, though still a bit shaken from the earlier incident, continued her work. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and attended to the other guests with a calm efficiency. Every gesture was precise, every smile genuine, reinforcing the quiet dignity she had displayed throughout the evening. Guests began to recognize her professionalism, exchanging subtle nods and appreciative glances. It was clear that her actions had left a lasting impression, one that contrasted sharply with the heiress's earlier behavior. Her husband, satisfied that the heiress had begun to understand the gravity of her actions, turned his attention briefly to the young waitress. He offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of her composure and professionalism. Though he said nothing aloud, the gesture spoke volumes. The young waitress felt a quiet sense of validation, a recognition that her patience and dignity had not gone unnoticed. It was a moment that reinforced her belief in the power of calm and grace in the face of adversity. The heiress, now visibly calmer, leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She realized that her previous sense of control had been an illusion, one that relied on fear and status rather than respect. The young waitress had shown her, through simple composure and professionalism, that true influence came from character, patience, and integrity. It was a lesson she would not soon forget. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. Guests resumed their conversations, though there was a new awareness in the air. The focus had moved from the heiress's wealth and antics to the quiet strength displayed by the young waitress and the composed authority of her husband. The contrast was stark, and it left a subtle but powerful impression on everyone present. The heiress's friends, sensing the change, began to behave more cautiously, realizing that their usual encouragement of arrogance and extravagance had no place in the current dynamic. The young waitress continued to serve with professionalism, her calm demeanor now a source of inspiration rather than pity. The room, once filled with tension and discomfort, now held a quiet admiration for the patience and dignity that had emerged from a moment of cruelty. By the end of the evening, the heiress had begun to understand that wealth alone could not command respect. She had been confronted with the reality that her actions had consequences, and that character mattered more than status. The young waitress, having handled a difficult situation with grace, had quietly demonstrated the power of patience, dignity, and composure. And the billionaire husband, through his calm authority and measured words, had reminded everyone present that true influence comes from integrity, fairness, and respect for others. The events of the evening would remain with everyone present, a lesson in humility, patience, and the subtle but undeniable power of character. The heiress, now reflecting on her behavior, began a journey of self-awareness and growth, one that would be guided not by wealth, but by the lessons she had witnessed firsthand. And the young waitress, though unaware of the full impact she had made, had proven that dignity and professionalism could shine even in the face of arrogance and cruelty. The tension in the restaurant remained palpable, though it had shifted. The heiress, who had spent the evening commanding attention with her wealth and arrogance, now found herself caught in a moment of vulnerability she had never fully experienced before. Her husband's calm but penetrating gaze lingered, and she felt the weight of accountability pressing down on her. She had expected the night to be filled with admiration, laughter, and indulgence, but instead, it had turned into a lesson she could not escape. The young waitress moved quietly among the tables, ensuring that every guest was attended to. Her hands were steady, her expression composed, and her posture confident despite the events that had unfolded earlier. She had become an unexpected focal point of the evening, her quiet dignity contrasting sharply with the heiress's earlier theatrics. Each polite nod, each careful gesture, reinforced the message that respect was earned, not demanded. Some guests began to glance at her with admiration, recognizing the strength required to remain professional in the face of deliberate humiliation. The heiress tried to regain some semblance of control. She adjusted her gown and smiled faintly, hoping to mask her discomfort. "Well, I suppose mistakes happen," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Her friends looked at her nervously, sensing that the evening had taken an unexpected turn. The heiress had always been used to having her power unquestioned, her wealth a shield against any form of judgment. Now, however, she felt that shield slipping, and it left her uncertain and exposed. Her husband spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "Mistakes are understandable," he said, "but intentionally causing harm or humiliation is not." His words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. The heiress's friends exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this was not a conversation that could be deflected with laughter or excuses. The young waitress, standing nearby, felt a quiet sense of reassurance. Her composure had not gone unnoticed, and the focus had shifted from her being a target to being a model of patience and dignity. The heiress took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She looked around the room, seeing the subtle expressions on the faces of the guests and staff. The realization began to sink in. Her behavior had consequences, and the admiration she had once assumed would follow her every move was no longer guaranteed. For the first time, she felt the vulnerability of being judged not for her wealth, but for her character. Her husband continued, addressing both the heiress and the young waitress in a way that was deliberate and composed. "We all have choices," he said. "How we treat others defines who we are, far more than money, status, or power. Today we saw both extremes. One of you acted with patience and respect, even under pressure. The other allowed frustration to dictate behavior, causing unnecessary harm. His gaze shifted to the heiress, who lowered her eyes, unable to meet it. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, as everyone in the restaurant waited to see what she would do next. The heiress's friends remained quiet, sensing that this moment was significant. The young waitress, though aware of the attention, remained composed, her posture straight and her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had no desire for recognition or reward. Her goal had always been to perform her duties with professionalism and grace. Yet, in this moment, her quiet strength became a silent lesson to everyone present. Finally, the heiress spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I am sorry," she said, glancing at the young waitress. The apology was hesitant, but it carried sincerity. There was a tremor in her tone, a reflection of the embarrassment and shame she felt. It was a moment of genuine humility, one that had been absent from her behavior earlier in the evening. The guests, sensing the change, began to relax slightly, their curiosity shifting from judgment to quiet approval of the young waitress's patience and the heiress's acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. The young waitress nodded politely, accepting the apology with grace. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice calm and composed. There was no bitterness, no trace of resentment, only a quiet dignity that reinforced the lesson already unfolding. The heiress's friends looked on, perhaps realizing for the first time that true respect could not be demanded, only earned through behavior and integrity. Her husband's gaze softened as he observed the interaction. He could see that the heiress was beginning to understand the implications of her actions. "Acknowledging a mistake is the first step toward growth," he said. "True strength lies in learning from it and treating others with kindness and respect, regardless of their position." His words were gentle but firm, offering guidance without condescension. The heiress nodded, absorbing the lesson, and the young waitress continued her work, quietly ensuring that the evening continued smoothly. As the night progressed, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. The initial tension faded, replaced by a sense of reflection and learning. Guests resumed their conversations, but now there was an undercurrent of awareness about the events that had unfolded. The heiress, though still feeling the sting of embarrassment, had begun to reflect on her behavior and its consequences. She realized that the power she once believed she held through wealth and status was temporary and superficial. True influence came from respect, fairness, and the way one treated others. The young waitress, moving through the room with quiet efficiency, continued to demonstrate the power of patience and professionalism. Every smile, every careful gesture, reinforced the lesson she had unintentionally imparted. The guests, observing her composure, began to recognize that humility and dignity often had a greater impact than wealth and arrogance. The contrast between the two women became a central theme of the evening, a living example of character versus privilege. Her husband's presence remained steady, a reminder of accountability and the importance of integrity. He occasionally offered subtle guidance, ensuring that the heiress understood the depth of the lesson without humiliation. His calm authority provided a framework for reflection, allowing the heiress to internalize the experience rather than react defensively. The young waitress, though largely unaware of the full extent of the observation, continued to serve with grace, her quiet strength providing a stabilizing influence in the room. At one point, the heiress paused, taking a moment to observe the young waitress more closely. She noticed the way she moved with care, attended to every guest, and maintained composure despite the earlier incident. For the first time, the heiress felt genuine admiration, mingled with regret. She realized that she had underestimated the power of patience, dignity, and professionalism. Her husband's earlier words echoed in her mind. How we treat others defines who we are. The contrast between herself and the young waitress had never been clearer. The heiress's friends, sensing the shift in her demeanor, began to adjust their own behavior. They spoke more quietly, laughed less loudly, and observed the young waitress with newfound respect. The room, once dominated by arrogance and privilege, was now filled with a quiet appreciation for the values of patience, dignity, and integrity. The young waitress, unaware of the ripple effect she had created, continued her duties, focusing on the task at hand with calm determination. Her husband approached her briefly, offering a subtle nod of approval. Though he spoke no words aloud, the gesture carried immense meaning. It acknowledged her composure, professionalism, and the quiet strength she had demonstrated. The heiress, observing the exchange, felt a mixture of envy and awe. She realized that the young waitress's dignity had left a far greater impression than any display of wealth or status could have. As the evening drew to a close, the heiress reflected on the events that had transpired. She had begun the night with confidence, relying on wealth and privilege to navigate the room. By the end, she had been confronted with the reality that true respect and influence come from character, not money. The young waitress had shown her, through quiet composure and professionalism, the power of integrity in action. It was a lesson that the heiress would carry with her long after the night had ended. The young waitress, finishing her final rounds, felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had faced a difficult and humiliating situation with grace, maintaining her dignity throughout. Though she had not sought recognition, her actions had inspired those around her, leaving a lasting impression on both guests and staff. The contrast between arrogance and humility, privilege and patience, had become the central narrative of the evening, and she had played a pivotal role in shaping it. The heiress's husband, observing the interactions, felt a quiet satisfaction. The lesson had been delivered, not through confrontation or anger, but through calm authority and the demonstration of integrity. The heiress had been forced to confront her behavior, recognize the consequences of her actions, and acknowledge the value of respect, patience, and humility. The young waitress had been the unintentional teacher, her composure serving as a model for what true professionalism and dignity looked like. By the time the night ended, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely. The initial tension and discomfort had given way to reflection, admiration, and a sense of growth. The heiress, humbled by the experience, began to understand that her actions had lasting consequences, and that wealth alone could never guarantee respect or influence. The young waitress, though unaware of the full impact she had made, had proven that patience, professionalism, and quiet strength could leave an indelible mark on those around her. As guests departed, many exchanged knowing glances, aware that they had witnessed more than just a dinner. They had witnessed a lesson in humility, integrity, and the true meaning of respect. The heiress, walking alongside her husband, reflected silently on the events, her mind processing the lessons she had learned. The young waitress returned to her station, quietly proud of the way she had handled the evening, unaware of the deeper influence she had had on the heiress and the guests. The night, which had begun with tension, arrogance, and cruelty, had ended with reflection, growth, and a quiet appreciation for the power of patience and dignity. The heiress, humbled and thoughtful, had learned that wealth could not shield her from accountability, and that true influence came from character and integrity. The young waitress had demonstrated the quiet strength that comes from composure, professionalism, and respect for others. And the billionaire husband had guided the situation with calm authority, ensuring that the lesson was clear, meaningful, and unforgettable. The restaurant had finally begun to settle after the tension of the evening. Guests were finishing their meals, chatting quietly among themselves, and some were exchanging glances that conveyed surprise, admiration, or reflection. The young waitress moved calmly among the tables, clearing plates and refilling glasses, her movements steady and graceful. Despite the chaos that had erupted earlier, she remained composed, demonstrating professionalism that now seemed to draw the quiet respect of everyone around her. The heiress, still seated at her table, was noticeably different from the confident, commanding figure she had been when the evening began. Her gown sparkled under the chandeliers, but her posture was more subdued, and the sharpness in her voice had vanished. She watched the young waitress with a mixture of curiosity and humility, realizing that this quiet, hard-working woman had shown her a lesson she would not soon forget. For the first time, the The heiress understood that true respect and admiration could not be bought or demanded. It had to be earned through integrity, patience, and grace. Her husband, standing beside her, observed the subtle shift with a quiet satisfaction. He had entered the evening knowing that his wife's behavior had the potential to cause embarrassment, but he also knew that moments like this were opportunities for growth. He did not need to scold or lecture harshly. The events themselves, coupled with the young waitress's composure, were already teaching the lesson. His calm presence allowed the heiress to reflect on her actions without feeling publicly attacked, creating space for genuine understanding and remorse. The heiress spoke quietly to her husband, her voice tinged with both embarrassment and realization. "I never expected to feel exposed like this," she admitted, glancing down at her hands. Her tone was soft, almost vulnerable, and it carried the weight of someone who had begun to see the consequences of their choices. "I thought my wealth made everything easy, that I could do as I pleased without anyone noticing or caring." Her husband nodded slowly, his expression calm but firm. "Wealth can open doors," he said, "but it cannot teach respect or integrity. Those are lessons that come from how we treat others, no matter who they are." Tonight was a reminder that our actions, especially the cruel ones, affect people far more than we sometimes realize. His words were measured, and they resonated deeply. The heiress absorbed them silently, her mind replaying the earlier moments. The spilled wine, the quiet dignity of the young waitress, and the awkward silence of the room as she realized her behavior had consequences. Meanwhile, the young waitress continued her duties, unaware of the deeper impact she had made. Each smile she offered, each tray she carried with care, and each polite word spoken to guests reinforced her professionalism. She did not act for recognition, yet she had become the quiet hero of the evening. Her calm, composed handling of an uncomfortable and humiliating situation had shifted the energy of the room and highlighted a truth that the heiress could no longer ignore. Character mattered far more than wealth. The heiress took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the young waitress. I want to apologize again," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "What I did was wrong, and I shouldn't have treated you that way." There was a pause, a moment that felt heavy with acknowledgement and reflection. The young waitress met her eyes and smiled gently, nodding in acceptance. "Thank you," she replied simply, her tone calm and composed. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only quiet dignity that underscored the lesson the heiress had learned. Guests at nearby tables had begun to notice the exchange. Whispers passed quietly among them, as they recognized the significance of the moment. What had started as a scene of arrogance and cruelty had transformed into a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of professionalism. Some guests nodded to themselves, quietly reflecting on how small acts of patience and integrity could speak louder than wealth, status, or privilege. The contrast between the heiress's initial behavior and the young waitress's response was striking, and it left an impression on everyone present. The heiress's husband watched silently, a subtle smile playing on his lips. He understood that this moment would stay with his wife, shaping her actions and decisions in the future. He had seen her arrogance softened by humility, her confidence tempered by reflection, and her behavior guided by a newfound understanding of respect. The young waitress, unknowingly, had played a pivotal role in teaching a valuable life lesson through her patience, composure, and dignity. The heiress spoke again, this time more confidently, though still with humility. "I hope you understand that my apology is genuine," she said to the young waitress. "I have acted foolishly tonight, and you have shown me how to handle a situation with grace. I admire that." The young waitress's eyes softened, and she offered a polite smile. "It means a lot that you say that," she replied. "We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we handle them." The heiress's husband nodded approvingly. "Exactly," he said. "Acknowledgement and growth are more important than perfection. Everyone makes mistakes, but integrity is shown in how we respond afterward." His words reinforced the importance of accountability, and the heiress nodded silently, reflecting on how she had let her wealth and pride cloud her judgment. As the evening drew closer to its conclusion, the heiress continued to observe the young waitress. She noticed the way she interacted with other guests, maintaining a warm smile and courteous tone, even as the memory of the wine spill lingered. She realized that true strength was not loud or showy. It was quiet, steady, and unwavering, even under pressure. It was the kind of strength that commanded respect without demanding it, the kind that inspired admiration through actions rather than words. The young waitress, finishing her final rounds, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had navigated a difficult evening with dignity and professionalism, and though she sought no recognition, her actions had made a lasting impression. The guests had seen the power of patience, humility, and grace, and the heiress had learned an invaluable lesson about the limits of wealth and the importance of respect. The heiress's husband addressed her one final time. "Remember tonight," he said softly but firmly. "Wealth can bring many opportunities, but it cannot replace respect, kindness, or integrity. What you learn tonight will shape how others see you, and more importantly, how you see yourself." The heiress nodded slowly, her thoughts heavy with reflection. She understood that this experience had been more than a lesson in etiquette or social behavior. It had been a lesson in humanity, empathy, and character. The young waitress, having completed her duties, returned to a quiet corner to rest briefly. She observed the remaining guests as they prepared to leave, noting the subtle smiles and appreciative glances directed her way. Though she had not sought attention or praise, she could feel the quiet acknowledgement of her professionalism and patience. The contrast between her behavior and the heiress's earlier arrogance was stark, and it left a lasting impression on the room. The heiress, finally standing to leave, approached the young waitress once more. "Thank you for your patience tonight," she said sincerely. "I will not forget this lesson." Her voice carried a new weight, one of humility and recognition. The young waitress nodded politely, smiling gently. "It was my job," she replied simply. "But I'm glad you understand the importance of respect and kindness." Her husband joined them as they prepared to leave. He offered a small nod to the young waitress, an unspoken acknowledgement of her role in the evening's events. The heiress followed, her posture still refined but noticeably humbled. As they walked toward the exit, the guests and staff watched, recognizing the transformation that had taken place. The evening, which had begun with arrogance, cruelty, and tension, had concluded with reflection, growth, and a renewed sense of respect. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and the cool evening air offered a moment of calm after the intensity of the dinner. The heiress walked beside her husband, her mind still processing the events of the evening. She felt a mixture of embarrassment, gratitude, and introspection. The young waitress, a quiet presence within the restaurant, had unintentionally taught her one of the most valuable lessons she had ever encountered. That wealth could not replace character, and that patience, composure, and respect were more powerful than any social status or privilege. The young waitress returned home that night feeling quietly proud. She had faced a difficult situation without losing her dignity, and her actions had left an impression on both the guests and the heiress. Though she had not sought recognition, she could sense the subtle shift in perception among those present. She had demonstrated that strength and professionalism often speak louder than wealth and arrogance, and that one's true character is revealed in moments of challenge. The heiress, reflecting on the evening, made a silent promise to herself. She would carry the lesson she had learned into her daily life, striving to treat others with the respect, patience, and kindness that had been modeled by the young waitress. She realized that true growth came not from wealth or privilege, but from understanding the value of humility and integrity. The billionaire husband, satisfied with the outcome, offered a final word of guidance. "Remember, it is not wealth that defines you, but how you use it and how you treat those around you," he said. His words were a reminder that influence is earned, respect is given, and character is revealed through actions. The heiress nodded, absorbing the lesson fully, and for the first time that evening, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose beyond status or social expectation. As the restaurant emptied and the evening drew to a close, the story of that night lingered in the minds of everyone present. The young waitress's quiet strength had left an unforgettable mark. The heiress had faced the consequences of her actions and learned a lasting lesson, and the husband had guided the experience with calm wisdom. The events of the evening would be remembered not for the spilled wine or the initial cruelty, but for the transformation, the reflection, and the demonstration of integrity, patience, and respect that followed. The heiress, now humbled, had discovered that the true measure of a person is not their wealth or social standing, but their character and the way they treat others. The young waitress, through her composure and professionalism, had reminded everyone that strength is often quiet, dignity is powerful, and respect must be earned through actions rather than assumed through privilege. And the husband, through his calm presence and measured guidance, had ensured that the lessons of the evening would resonate far beyond a single dinner. By the time the lights were dimmed and the last guests departed, the restaurant had returned to its quiet state. The events of the evening had changed more than one person. The heiress would carry the lesson with her. The young waitress had proven the power of integrity, and the memory of the night would serve as a reminder that true strength lies not in wealth, but in character. The spilled wine, the initial embarrassment, and the tension had all been transformed into a story of growth, humility, and respect that would remain with everyone involved for a long time.